Picture an ice storm rolling across the Great Plains. The sky is the color of wet iron. Rain hammers the bare branches and freezes the instant it touches the ground. Every twig, every leaf, every inch of earth is soaked through. A modern person standing in this place, without a lighter or a match, would not survive the night. Their bones would lock. Their breath would grow shallow. And yet, for thousands of years, on this exact ground, in this exact weather, a human being could kneel down with nothing but a few sticks and a small leather pouch and pull warmth out of the world. They did not pray for it. They did not gamble on luck. They did it on demand, in a downpour, in a blizzard, in the heart of a winter that wanted them dead. Native Americans treated firemaking in foul weather not as a miracle but as a craft, a system, a discipline passed from grandfather to grandson, refined across centuries until it looked almost invisible, almost casual. From the outside, the skill seemed simple: a bow, a stick, a handful of dust. Inside that simplicity was an entire library of knowledge about wood, weather, breath, patience, and the quiet behavior of heat. Stay with this story to the end, because before we finish, you will know exactly which mushroom they harvested for tinder, how they hid dry wood inside their own clothes, and why a fire built on a meter of snow does not sink into the cold below it. But first, we have to understand something stranger. To these people, fire was not a chemical reaction. It was alive, and the way they spoke to it changed everything that followed. But to understand how they coaxed a flame out of a frozen forest, we first have to understand who they thought they were speaking to. Before we touch a stick or strike a stone, we have to step into a different mind. For most native nations across North America, fire was not an object. It was a being. It had moods. It had ancestors. It could be insulted, ignored, or invited. It could not be commanded. This sounds like poetry until you watch what it actually did to the work. A person who believes fire is alive will not rush. They will not curse. They will not break the rhythm when a spark dies. They will treat every failure as a quiet message. I was careless. I was loud. I came to this with the wrong heart. So they slowed down. They breathed differently. They prepared the materials the night before, by the last good light, when their hands were still steady. Friction was not labor. It was a conversation, and the conversation had to be polite. There was another quiet idea inside this worldview. Trees had spirits too. Cedar was generous. Juniper was generous. Cottonwood gave up its dust easily. Other trees were stubborn and refused to spark no matter how hard you worked them. You did not fight a stubborn tree. You walked away and found a friendlier one. To outsiders, this looked like superstition. To anyone who has actually tried to start a fire by friction in cold, wet hands, it looks like the only sane way to keep from losing your mind. Patience here was not a virtue. It was a tool, as real and as physical as the drill itself. And the tool they trusted most, the one that turned patience into a glowing ember, had 4 pieces and a single secret. Of all the friction methods on the continent, one stood above the rest for reliability in bad weather: the bow drill. It was not the oldest method, it was simply the smartest. Rubbing 2 sticks between the palms generates heat slowly and burns out the hands long before it burns out the wood. The bow drill solved that problem by turning a human arm into a machine. The kit had 4 pieces. The bow, a curved, springy branch strung with rawhide or twisted plant fiber. The spindle, a straight, dry hardwood stick about the length of a forearm, pointed at the bottom, rounded at the top. The hearthboard, a flatter piece of softer wood, cottonwood, willow, cedar, with a small socket carved into it and a narrow V-shaped notch cut into the side. And the handhold, a small block of stone, bone, or hardwood with a dimple in it, used to press down on the spindle from above without burning the palm. Once the string was looped once around the spindle, the body became the engine. 1 knee on the ground, 1 foot pinning the hearthboard flat, 1 hand pressing down through the handhold, the other hand pulling the bow back and forth in long, even strokes. The spindle spun. The wood dust gathered in the V-notch. Fine, dark, hot. Around 400 degrees, the dust began to smoke on its own. A small black coal, no larger than a grain of rice, was now glowing in the notch. That tiny coal was the goal. Not flame, not warmth. Just one stubborn ember, fragile enough to die in a single careless breath. And here is the part most people miss. That ember, on its own, is useless. It cannot light wood. It cannot even light grass. It can only light one thing. And finding that one thing was the harder skill. What they fed that ember was sometimes more precious than the bow itself. A coal the size of a grain of rice has perhaps 30 seconds of life in cold, wet air. Less, if the wind moves. To turn that fragile thing into a fire, you need a material that does not need a flame to wake up. A material that drinks heat and gives back smoke. That material is tinder, and native tinder craft was a quiet art that took years to learn. The finest tinder did not grow in the open. It grew on the sides of dead trees. Tinder fungus, a hard hoof-shaped bracket that clings to birch and beech, held the secret. Only the soft inner layer was used, the Amadou. Harvested, dried, sometimes simmered in wood ash water, then pounded and stretched until it had the texture of suede. This fungus could catch even a weak ember and hold it for an hour without bursting into flame. It smoldered with the patience of a stone. It almost refused to be put out by wind. The second great tinder was the inner bark of certain trees, cedar especially, juniper close behind. The papery layers were rubbed and twisted between the palms until they came apart into a soft golden fluff that looked like spun light. This fluff was the opposite of the fungus. It exploded into flame the instant a spark touched it. So they layered the two. Spark first onto fluff, fluff onto the smoldering fungus, fungus into the kindling. 3 different materials, each doing a job the others could not, and every one of them was stored, dry as bone, in a sealed pouch worn against the body. Even more remarkable, a smoldering piece of Amadou could be carried for hours inside a shell or clay pot with small air holes, a living coal traveling across the landscape from one camp to the next, so the people never had to start from nothing. But there was another way to make a spark, a method older than any drill, and one that worked even when wood itself could not be trusted. In dry regions, on the open plains, in the high deserts, wood for a bow drill was not always available. So another method took its place, striking. And here, most people picture flint and steel. But before European contact, there was no steel on this continent. The native version used a mineral most people have never held. Pyrite, iron pyrite, fool's gold. Strike a sharp-edged piece of flint against a chunk of pyrite, and the mineral sheds a shower of small, brilliant sparks. Not as hot as steel sparks, not as long-lived, but hot enough if the tinder beneath them is perfect. This was an unforgiving technique. The sparks fell for half a second. The tinder had to be powder dry. Often charred fungus or pulverized bark dust held a hair's width below the strike. A clumsy angle, a damp grain, a breath of wind, and the spark died mid-air. When Europeans arrived with small steel strikers, the change was immediate. Steel sparks were hotter, brighter, longer-lived. Within a generation, the steel striker had become one of the most sought-after trade goods in North America. It was tiny, it was tough, it did not care about rain. A warrior could crouch under a hide cloak in a thunderstorm, strike once, and have a coal. The drill needed dry wood for its own parts. The striker did not. Stone and steel were not affected by moisture. All they needed was a dry pinch of tinder, kept safe against the chest. Within decades, this small piece of metal had quietly replaced techniques that had served the continent for centuries. But every method, drill or striker, runs into the same wall. And that wall is finding wood that will actually burn in a wet world. Here is the rule every native firemaker learned before they learned anything else. Never take wood from the ground. Wood lying on the ground has been drinking water for days. It looks dry on the outside and is rotten with moisture inside. It will hiss, smoke, and kill any flame you try to build with it. What you want is standing deadwood, branches and small trees that died but never fell. Water runs off them. Wind dries them. The lower dead limbs of evergreens, tucked tight against the trunk under the canopy, are often as dry in a rainstorm as they were a week before. The dense crown of a spruce or pine acts as a natural umbrella, and the inner shell of the tree stays in its own private climate. Better still was the dry heart inside a dead trunk. A standing dead tree, soaked black on the outside, will almost always have dry, pale wood at its core. They chipped away the wet outer layer with a stone blade, reached the dry interior, and shaved off long, thin curls, kindling, that had never seen rain in its life. Then there were the small treasures. Pitch, resin, the amber blood of pine and spruce, scraped from wounds in the bark. Resin burns hot, burns fast, and burns wet. Pinch a piece into the tinder bundle, and the flame turns aggressive, hissing at the rain instead of fearing it. Birch bark, that papery white skin, contained its own oils and lit even when soaked. They peeled it carefully, never killing the tree, and carried strips like little white insurance policies. In deep snow, the technique shifted again. They dug down to the base of a tree where the trunk had blocked the snowfall and found dry leaves and frozen twigs sheltered in that hidden pocket. The forest was never as wet as it looked. You just had to know where its secrets were hiding. And when even those secret hiding places had failed, when every twig in the world was soaked, they used the most surprising heat source of all to dry their fuel. This is the trick almost no modern survival guide talks about. If a hunter knew he might be sleeping in the open in bad weather, he began drying his kindling at sunrise. Small twigs, slivers of inner bark, a pinch of fungus, all of it tucked inside his clothing, against his ribs, against the warm hollow of his lower back. The human body runs at 98 degrees, 24 hours a day. It is, in effect, a slow oven. By dusk, the wood pressed against his skin had given up its moisture into the leather, into the wool, into the air. He could pull out a handful of perfectly dry kindling from inside a coat that was wet on the outside. The Cree and the Athabascans in the subarctic carried tinder this way as a matter of routine. It was insurance you wore. And once a fire was burning, even a small one, a second drying system kicked in. They built a small grate of green sticks above the flames and laid wet wood on top, not into the fire, but over it. The rising heat steamed the moisture out. You could watch it leaving, a curl of pale vapor lifting from each branch. When the steam stopped, the wood was ready. Behind the fire, they often set a wall of logs or stones, a reflector that bounced heat back into the camp and accelerated the drying. Wet wood became dry wood, became flame. A continuous loop, fed by nothing but patience. Through this slow rhythm, a single small fire could survive for days inside a forest that should, by every law of weather, have drowned it within an hour. And every one of these techniques relied on a single object, small, worn close, guarded like a child. Every adult who left camp carried one, a small leather pouch, often worn around the neck or on the belt, holding the entire system in miniature. Inside, depending on the region, a spindle, a small handhold, a coil of cord, a piece of flint, a striker, pyrite before contact, steel after, and most importantly, the tinder container. That container was the heart of the kit. Some were boxes of hardwood with tight-fitting lids, some were horns sealed with pitch, some were doubled pouches of leather, the inside coated with rendered fat to repel water. Inside, layered carefully, sat the slow tinder, Amadou, charred fungus, and the fast tinder, bark fluff, dried moss. Often a small lump of pine resin was tucked in beside them as an accelerant. Losing this kit was not an inconvenience. In winter, it was a death sentence. A warrior could lose his bow and replace it. He could lose his food and hunt again. He could not lose his fire kit and survive a January night. So the kit was protected like a child, kept dry like a wound, checked obsessively before any journey. The lesson buried in this object is simple. Native firemakers did not hope for good weather. They assumed bad weather, every time, and prepared for it long before the sky ever turned gray. Their confidence in the storm was not bravery, it was preparation. But even with the perfect kit, two specific battlefields demanded their own playbooks: fire on snow and fire in rain. Building a fire directly on a snowfield is a beginner's mistake. The flame melts the snow beneath it, sinks into the meltwater, and dies in its own puddle. Native peoples of the subarctic and northern plains knew this from childhood. So when the snow was shallow, they cleared a circle down to bare earth, a small dry stage on which to build. When the snow was meters deep, they did something cleverer. They stamped a patch flat, packing the snow as hard as ice, then laid a platform of thick, wet logs across it. The fire was built on top of the wet logs. The logs would not catch, they were too wet, but they smoldered, dried, and charred from the heat above. The platform sank slowly through the night as the snow compressed beneath it, but the fire itself stayed dry. Behind the fire they often built a wall, sometimes of snow blocks, paradoxically, because packed snow blocks wind and reflects heat back into the camp. In rain, the problem was different. Water came from every direction, sliding down trunks, dripping from leaves. The first task was shelter, a rock overhang, a spruce with skirts low to the ground, the dry circle at the base of a giant tree. Inside that small dry zone, the firemaker became a fortress. He sat down, pulled a hide cloak over himself and his materials, and built the fire under his own body. He scraped shavings from the lee side of standing deadwood, where the wind had kept the rain from soaking deepest. He fed the ember a needle of bark first, then a thread of dry grass, then a splinter, then a twig. The fire climbed in size like a pyramid, smallest at the base, working up. Rushing was the only real enemy. Add a wet branch too soon, and the whole structure collapsed. Wait, breathe, feed it slowly, and even in a storm the flame learned to stand on its own. Within minutes it would begin to dry its own fuel. Within an hour, it owned the campsite. And the people who did this routinely, century after century, were carrying something we have almost entirely forgotten. None of this was magic. All of it was knowledge, botany, physics, weather reading, the anatomy of trees, the behavior of heat, the behavior of breath. A native firemaker could identify a dozen fungi by feel, could tell a friendly hearthwood from a stubborn one by smell, could read a hillside in a single glance, and know where the dry pocket would be hiding. This knowledge was as ordinary to them as reading a phone screen is to us, and it traveled by hand, from grandfather to grandchild, every generation, for thousands of years. Today, almost all of it is gone. A lighter the size of a thumb replaces a lifetime of observation. We have made ourselves powerful, and, in the same motion, helpless. Drop a modern person into a wet forest with no plastic in their pockets, and the cold will own them by nightfall. The point of remembering these old methods is not nostalgia, it is humility. There was a way of living in which a human being was not the master of nature but its student, patient, watchful, respectful. The fire kit worn at the belt was a quiet confession that the world is bigger than you are, and a promise that you have done your part to be ready for it. Modern reenactors now spend weeks trying to recreate in clumsy hands what a native child could do in a few minutes. That gap is not just skill, it is worldview. We can still learn it back. The wood is still standing. The mushrooms still grow on the dead birches. The cold has not changed. Only we have. What other lost skills of the first peoples of this continent would you like us to uncover next? Their winter shelters, their hunting craft, their long-distance signaling. Tell us in the comments, and subscribe, so the next forgotten secret finds you when it returns.